engagement leader.
I'd like to tell you about how one man, my late husband Gerald Durrell, inspired generations of nature conservationists, and how his achievements and legacy have shaped one of today's most influential and effective conservation organizations, Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust. Jerry and his trust are truly one of Jersey's USPs, and I'm delighted to have been asked to speak to Chamber in this, our 60th anniversary year. Now, Jerry often said that his life began on the island of Corfu, an enchanting Greek island where he lived as a boy with his family in the 1930s. As a youngster, he explored every nook and cranny, seeking out wildlife, from earwigs to eagle owls, to nourish his growing passion for wildlife. Jerry's most enduring, and some people say most endearing, book described this magical childhood on the island of Corfu. This and his other Corfu books are enjoying a revival thanks to the popular television series The Durrells. And here I've got a shot of the TV family, whom you will all, I hope, recognize. But here's the real family. This is Louisa Durrell. The mother is on the right. Oh, I'm a little behind. Sorry, a little behind. Louisa is on the right, not looking at all like Keeley Hawes. And Jerry's next to her. That's Lawrence in an artistic pose on the balustrade. And next to him is his wife, Nancy. And next to Nancy is Margot, the sister. And I'm pretty sure it must have been, it was Leslie taking the photograph. So the family thought the little boy would outgrow his passion for animals. What did Jerry do when he grew up? Well, he devoted his life to animals, of course. He started out as an animal collector for zoos, traveling in West Africa and South America. But he became unhappy with the profligate attitude of zoos of the day towards the animals that he brought to them. They often died soon after their arrival in those zoos. And the attitude was summed up by what zoos would tell Jerry: oh, don't worry about this. There are plenty more where they came from. Well, Jerry could see at first hand that this was not the case, and he determined to have his own zoo, one devoted to the conservation of wild species and their habitats, and his mission was to save species from extinction. He settled his animals in his sister's garden in Bournemouth. This was to be a temporary arrangement before he found a place for his own zoo. But 2 years later, he still had not found it. In 1958, Jerry visited the beautiful island of Jersey, and he came away with the intention of establishing his zoo here, having found the ideal place in Trinity and receiving the blessing of the then head of tourism, Senator Krzyzewski. Both Jerry and his animals were warmly welcomed by the islanders, and by March 1959, Jersey Zoo opened to the public. One of Jerry's earliest dreams was to set up a non-profit charitable trust to undertake his mission, including running the zoo on conservation principles. He achieved this in 1963, and he chose for the trust's emblem the dodo, the large flightless bird from the island of Mauritius, which was driven to extinction by the early settlers. To Jerry, the dodo symbolized the fragility and vulnerability of species upon encountering Homo sapiens. He vowed that no species the trust chose to help would follow the dodo to oblivion. In the early days, we concentrated on breeding our animals, and this is our first silverback gorilla. I hope some of you remember Jambo, the famous Jambo. Jambo had more than 180 descendants, that is, his children and his grandchildren, in zoos around the world today. Many of them are still living, as is his firstborn. That is a Sambo, who is now the silverback gorilla at a zoo in Germany. Well, we concentrated on studying our animals and disseminating the results. An in-house journal for staff and visiting researchers began in 1964, and this was an unheard of thing to happen for a zoo in those days. It was called The Dodo, published annually for nearly 40 years until printing costs became too onerous. However, it has resurfaced today as an online journal called The Solitaire, which is the name of another flightless and extinct bird from an island near Mauritius. Now, most zoos of the day would display only impressive, well-known species, good for the box office, like tigers and elephants. Jerry believed that every species had intrinsic value, and that we humans had no right to drive any of them to extinction. Now, no animal was too obscure or too drab for Jerry. His early expeditions to collect animals for breeding targeted such species as the volcano rabbit, the little rabbit you see here. Jerry called them the little brown jobs, or the LBJs. This volcano rabbit comes from Mexico, and it had been declining through habitat loss to agriculture. Jerry mounted a rescue expedition, this was in the 60s, to bring some back for breeding in Jersey. In the early 70s, he came across this species. This is the smallest member of the pig family, called the pygmy hog from Assam in India, thought to be extinct but rediscovered in 1971, and clearly needing the kind of conservation help that Jerry was able to give it. Now, because of the dodo from Mauritius, that island, the island of Mauritius, was like a magnet to Jerry. He first visited the island in the mid-70s. This was really when the Trust's efforts in the field, in the wild, really took off. Jerry had the good fortune to meet and mentor a young student, Carl Jones, who was burning to save some critically endangered Mauritian species that other conservationists had actually given up on. For example, one of those was the Mauritius kestrel. This was a species that had declined just to 4 individuals left in the world, who can hardly get closer to extinction than that. But Jerry encouraged Carl, and the Trust backed him in breeding and release programs in Mauritius. And so Carl and his team brought back this species from the brink of extinction. And there are now hundreds flying free in Mauritius. 2 other species found only in Mauritius have responded to Carl Jones's attentions. One's called the pink pigeon, and the other is the echo parakeet, seen there eating a very hot chili pepper. I don't know if you knew this, but parrots can stand the hottest chili peppers ever. Today, though, there are both species were reduced in numbers to fewer than 20 individuals. But today there are now 300 wild pigeons and 800 wild parakeets flying free in Mauritius. And that parakeet program is probably the most successful for a parrot program in the world today. Now, in Mauritius, Jerry saw opportunities to develop 2 of his other ideas about conservation, and one had to do with ecological restoration. This is what we call rewilding today. The perfect place to try it out was a little speck of an island off the coast of Mauritius called Round Island. Round Island resembled little more than a moonscape owing to overgrazing by rabbits and goats that had been introduced to the island in the previous century by passing sailors so they would have something to eat when they came through the next year. Some of the native species had already become extinct, and others, like this little lizard called a Telfair skink, cheeky little thing, were in steep decline. Well, Carl was again the leader in the effort to fix things. So the rabbits and goats were removed, and this little island began to green up, literally within months of the last rabbit coming off the island. The remaining populations of reptiles and seabirds began to thrive. Well, Carl still works for Durrell. He's become a professor, Professor Jones. He's our chief scientist. And in 2016, we were thrilled when he was awarded what's considered the Nobel Prize in Conservation, the Indianapolis Prize, for saving more species from extinction than anybody else in the world. And Carl still considers himself one of Jerry's disciples. Jerry's second idea was to create a mini university for conservation at Jersey Zoo. And he wanted our first student to come from the island of the dodo. Jerry believed that where breeding endangered species should happen was in their countries of origin by nationals of those countries. And he envisioned bringing people from all over the world to Jersey to work with our animals and our staff, study the techniques of species recovery that we'd been developing, and go back to their homelands to apply what they had learned. It was 1976 that Jerry and his PA, John Hartley, interviewed this man, Yusuf Mungru, in Mauritius. He's holding one of those pink pigeons there. And the story goes that at breakfast on the morning of the interview, John turned to Jerry and he said, you know, I know that you've had this idea, this vision for a long, long time, and it's something your heart is set on, but really it's not very practical. We have so few facilities at the zoo. We don't have a lecture hall, we don't have a library, we don't even have a residence hall. And Jerry apparently just put his hand in the air. He said, details, dear boy, mere details. So Yusuf became the first student of what is now called the Durrell Conservation Academy. And since those days, since Yusuf, the Academy has trained more than 6,000 students from 2/3 of the countries of the world. And so the Trust, to deliver its mission, developed this conservation toolbox of techniques. There's breeding at Jersey Zoo, research by our conservation science department, training at our what's now called the Academy, and restoration of wild populations and habitats in our field programs using a community-based approach. But all of these activities interact with one another and sustain each other, and this is what we deploy now all over the world. Jerry passed away in 1995, and the obituaries and the many letters that I received hail Jerry as an icon of nature conservation of the 20th century, and it really seemed that people were waking up to Jerry's message that biodiversity, which is the great variety of animals and plants on the planet and their ecosystems, was infinitely important, precious to us all, and we should do everything we could to protect and save it. In 1999, I readily gave my blessing to rename the Trust in honor of its founder, Gerald Durrell, and we literally wrote the mission in stone. You can see the mission stone at the entrance to the zoo now. Now this is the simplest but most powerful mission statement that I know of. It's only 4 words, but we do what it says. In the 24 years since Jerry passed away, the Trust has gone from strength to strength. We work in many different countries on endangered species and habitats in partnership with local communities. And here is a map of the various places. I've mentioned our early work in Assam in northern India on the pygmy hog, in Mauritius for a variety of species there. We continue to work on islands in the western Indian Ocean. We're working a lot in the New World now, as you can see there. And we're just starting up a program in Indonesia for the critically endangered songbirds. In Madagascar, our work encompasses everything from lemurs, like the black and white rough lemur you'll all know from the zoo, to tortoises. And as Jennifer said, I was very involved in the program for saving this tortoise, the plowshare tortoise of Madagascar. All our Madagascar work, particularly the community work, has been greatly assisted by Jersey Overseas Aid Committee, and for that the Trust is most grateful. In the Comoro Islands, north of Madagascar, there's this wonderful fine giant fruit bat, which you'll also see up at Jersey Zoo. It's called the Livingston's fruit bat, and we have a very good and important, probably the most important in the world, breeding colony of this species. In the Caribbean, we're studying the habits and the status of a very little-known mammal. I wonder if anybody can venture a guess as to what this is. No, it's called a selenodon. And it comes from the island of Hispaniola. The staff remember it by calling it the Celine Dion. We've turned the corner for this species, this beautiful parrot from St. Lucia. There were about 100 birds left in the 1970s, but there are now thousands of them today. We're also working with something called the mountain chicken. The mountain chicken is not a bird, but an enormous frog from the island of Montserrat. It was first threatened by the volcano there that erupted in the 90s, but now by this global epidemic of a devastating fungus that targets frogs, and it really is a pretty horrid thing. In South America, we focus on the group of little monkeys called the lion tamarins, and they're called lion tamarins because you can see that little mane around their heads. They are highly threatened by fragmentation of forest habitat. Now, briefly, back to the pygmy hog, because it really is a perfect example of all of our projects. And you can see in the upper right corner, that's the breeding station that we set up in Assam in India. On the left, upper left, is our community work that happens in all of our projects. And then down in the lower left is the release to the wild. And that man there is releasing the 100th captive-bred pygmy hog into one of the 2 wild populations that we have established there from scratch. So that's it's a fantastic program and doing really well. Now finally, we all know conservation begins in your own back garden. And here in Jersey, the Trust has worked with lizards, frogs, even an orchid species. But our current big project, and I think you're all probably aware of it, is for this species. It's called the red-billed chough. We carry this out in partnership with the States of Jersey Environment Department and the National Trust. But what happened was this species died out here in Jersey over 100 years ago due to change in land use and persecution for being a type of crow. But using stock we received from a zoo in Cornwall, we bred this species, we released others from Cornwall. We released about 30 individuals, but they've now started breeding in the wild. This is the release site is up at Sorrel. I'll show you there. And there are now more than 40 living in the wild. So choughs have now, I don't think we can quite say re-established yet, but they're getting pretty close, been re-established in Jersey. Our species focus has enormous ramifications, and I call it the iceberg effect, because focusing on species is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much else going on behind saving species. So we've restored habitats and gained knowledge, transferred skills, trained so many people, and reconnecting people to nature. Why are we successful? Well, I like to call it the bedrock effect, because we are underpinned in everything we do by the principles and values instilled by Gerald Durrell from the very beginning. So we work with all animals, not just big, sexy box office animals, but those little brown jobs. We know that conservation is a long-term commitment, and we know that conservation is all about people, whether it's about your staff, your graduates, your volunteers, and whatever. But how successful are we? Well, this graph was prepared by our conservation science department, and it shows how the fortunes of Durrell species have changed over time. Vertical axis is a measure of the likelihood of species survival. Going up is good, going down is bad. And the blue line is a plot of the species that we have worked with. Clearly their situation is improving. We then did what's called a counterfactual analysis, and that's what would have happened had Durrell not intervened with its conservation actions. And clearly those species would have been doomed. Rewild Our World is the conservation strategy that will guide Durrell until 2025. It's inspired by Jerry's legacy. We will continue in our mission to save species from extinction, but particularly by restoring ecosystems, as we pioneered with Round Island back in the 1980s, and by reconnecting people with nature, as Jerry did through his engaging books, and by starting a very special zoo here in Jersey. 2025 is a significant year for us. Jerry would have been 100 years old, and that's an appropriate moment for this strategy to aim for certain targets, pass milestones, and adjust the strategy as needed. But what inspired Jerry himself? What led him to inspire others in turn? Well, I think it's best expressed by the words that I had engraved on a stone in front of the Manor house of the zoo, where Jerry's ashes are buried. And I'd just like to read out those words to you. The beauty and genius of a work of art may be reconceived, though its first material expression be destroyed. A vanished harmony may yet again inspire the composer. But when the last individual of a race of living beings breathes no more, another heaven and another earth must pass before such a one can be again. Thank you all for listening. It's been a great pleasure and a privilege. Thank you.
may be a question or two in the audience. I'm going to open that up right now. If there is a question, please. Now is the time to raise that hand. Any questions you've got for Lee right at this moment? They won't be political, I know that much. But if you have a question, now is that opportunity to ask it, or forever hold it.
Not forever, Murray.
Certainly, we've got one right at the back there. Excellent. It means I've got to come all the way down.
Hi, I really enjoyed your speech. I thought it was wonderful. What could people, everyday people like me, us sitting around the table, do in our own lives to sort of help conservation as well? Are there sort of little things that we can be doing on a basic level in our gardens, for example?
So various things to do, as you said, they're little things, but you know, you add up all the little things and it makes a big difference. So ranging from things that we all know we're supposed to do, like recycle things, have a wildlife garden, make sure that your children get out and about in nature and appreciate it and learn about it. Bring people up to the zoo. That's a real good way to help. But yeah, I think the point is today is that we all know what we're supposed to do, but how many of us really do it? But just think about it and just think we are all going to have to do the things that we know are good for the environment. Otherwise, there's just not much hope. Thank you.
Lee, I just wanted to ask a question about the time that you and Jerry were building what we now know as Jersey Zoo, and that there were some pretty harebrained schemes that were going on at the time. I'd love to have been a fly on the wall of some of the conversations that you and Jerry were having very late at night when you'd finished an extraordinarily long day, 7 days a week. Can you give us just an insight into some of that?
Well, harebrained schemes. Usually the harebrained schemes actually happened. Somebody made them happen.
Yeah.
Like one was to celebrate the 1984 25th anniversary of the zoo. Our wonderful Simon Hicks, who was Trust Secretary at the time, some of you will remember Simon, had this idea to have something called a Festival of Animals. And he wanted all sorts of, people from all over the world to come, and celebrities, and lots of Jerry's friends, as a matter of fact, and people to visit. And Jerry said, where are we going to put them all? And what's the... and he said, well, hire Fort Regent. And so we did. And that really worked. It was such a great bonfire. Princess Royal, who's our patron, she came for it. So that was one scheme that happened. One that didn't happen, maybe it should have, is we were thinking of setting up a trust in Australia. And that never happened. I'm not sure why. That wasn't so harebrained, was it?
That seems like an obvious place when you consider some of the more difficult places that you've set up. I've been to a couple of the ones that you have set up around the world, and they're in extraordinarily remote places. So I can imagine that some of your earlier memories must have been almost Indiana Jones, like hacking through jungles somewhere to find places.
Oh, yeah, I guess so. Well, I was, as Jennifer mentioned, I did my dissertation research in Madagascar, which was, and still is, a very difficult place to live in. But Jerry had never been to Madagascar, so I was able to introduce him to that extraordinary country where all of the animals and plants are unique, and all of them are pretty much in danger. So again, we went around the country and just little airplanes and terrible roads, but it was just really, really gratifying for people like us.
I need to ask, because I almost got tipped out of it at one point, the Dodo-mobile, which was a golf buggy which Jerry used to use to get around in. He took me for a spin in that once, and it was a really scary moment.
That was because he was driving, Murray.
You know what he was like? Yeah.
Yes. Well, I think we've still got 2 Dodo-mobiles. We take our VIPs around in them. So.
Slower.
Very slowly.
Lee, unless there's any other questions from the floor, and I'm quite happy to say Andy's got a question over there, and we'll get one down the bottom as well.
Andy Joseph, thank you, Lee, for the lovely talk again. You must have had some great escape artists over the years, animals that managed to get out here and there.
So some great escapes.
Escape artists?
Yes, escape artists. Yes, indeed, we certainly have. I do remember the time, I guess, during my time, we were up in the flat, which, as you know, is in the middle of the manor house, and I looked out into the forecourt of the manor, and there was our big orangutan, Gambar, striding. Remember, he used to walk on two legs and striding through the forecourt. Then I remember I was there as well. The bears escaped when the bears were in that really rather small place that they used to be in. And both of them were up a tree, and they were lured down by ice cream. So that worked. We try not to have that happen too much now, but it does occasionally happen. But people are on the case now.
Another question over here.
Yeah, I was just going to say there was a snow leopard once. Did you hear about that? One of the snow leopards got out. There was somehow a hole in the mesh of his enclosure, and got out and just didn't know what to do. So just sat there right by the hole until somebody shoot him back in.
All right, another question over here.
It was a really great speech to inspire people about conservation. And you said that Gerald's opinions on biodiversity was a lot to do with his views on intrinsic value. I just want to know what your view of the value of biodiversity is.
Of the value of biodiversity, well, what can I say? It's nature's capital. It's probably the most important asset of the planet, if you like. Because, I mean, without it, without the animals and plants, we wouldn't have any air or soil or water or anything like that. It's the living component of the physical and living environment we've got. And we are but one species among, what now, modest numbers, about 10 million. We are an important one because we can make such a difference to the planet. But therefore we have more responsibility, and we have the biggest responsibility. But, you don't sort of tamper with Mother Nature or get her angry. So, very important.
That, I think, is a great message to finish the Q&A on. Lee, thank you very much for that. Before you go, I'm going to ask Lady Dalton to come and join me if I may, in something that we pre-rehearsed and pre-arranged about 10 seconds ago. Firstly, to present these to you.
Thank you.
And it's full of water, so you may want to put it down. I've also got here something which Chamber felt with the 60th anniversary and with your work. And I wanted to ask you actually just before that, you might need to move back to Command, but I wanted to ask you about Corfu, because Corfu has played a very... Do you want to just put them there? They're going to go over me. Before we close, Corfu, of course, has played a central role in the story of the Durrells, and we've seen it, we've loved it, and it's meant a great deal to Jersey, and to, obviously, the work of wildlife preservation. But your connection with Corfu doesn't end just there, does it?
My connection with Corfu, I'm pretty connected.
Mm-hmm.
I went first with Jerry in the 1980s and just fell in love with the place. And in the last 15 or so years, I've been going every year to lead a kind of a tour in the footsteps of Jerry, and it's a natural history tour. We have a botanist with us and an entomologist, and we just have a fantastic time all over the island. More recently, with the Durrell series, there have been UK tour companies interested in doing something similar, so I'm out there now 5 times a year, taking people to Durrell spots. And probably another thing you all didn't know, one reason it's so special to me, is that half of Jerry's ashes are in the forecourt of the Manor, under the stone. The other half I put in the sea off this little island at Corfu called Mouse Island. You may have read about that. And so Jerry's spirit is there. And I just learned recently that Jerry's sister's, Margot's granddaughter, put her ashes there as well. So it's all a big family back at Corfu. And indeed, I have just, last year, I bought a house there. And I've been going there. It's a very old house, needs a lot of work. But so I've been going there pretty regularly. So
I'm right in thinking they've made you a citizen of Corfu?
that is correct. I'm an honorary citizen of Corfu. Yeah.
Well, you're a very valued citizen of Jersey. The Chamber of Commerce wanted to mark the 60th anniversary, and indeed your contribution, by acknowledging and thanking you for your outstanding contribution to the island of Jersey. Leader, thank you very much.
Thank you.